The way that many in the Elden Ring community reacted to the lore revelations found in the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC was, frankly, disturbing. Prior to the DLC, we knew that Queen Marika was responsible for multiple genocides. In the DLC, we learn that Queen Marika is responsible for yet another genocide, that of the Hornsent. Many in the Elden Ring community reacted to this information by stating that the Hornsent, the victims of ethnic cleansing and genocide, got what they deserved. This raises serious questions about how we understand, conceptualize, and narrativize violence, especially violence that is literally or metaphorically distant. Namely, what are the prevailing approaches to narrativizing distant acts of violence, and what are the material effects associated with these approaches in works of fiction and in the real world? This video essay addresses these questions with reference to two specific case studies: the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, and Israel's genocide against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. On that note, if you're new here, you should know that this is not a conventional Elden Ring lore video, which is to say that this video does not examine the in-game story in a vacuum, in isolation from real-world political concerns. Rather than going out of our way to ignore the obvious parallels between the in-game story and real-world political issues, those parallels are going to be our central focus, and we're going to reflect on what those parallels say about us as individuals, communities, and societies. But before we can address the community's response to the lore revelations found in the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, we need to establish some in-game context, starting with what we knew about Queen Marika prior to the DLC's release. As noted by a YouTuber named Ikaros in a video concerned with the community's response to Messmer's crusade against the Hornsent, which I'll link in the video description below, we learn in the base game that Marika is either directly or indirectly responsible for multiple genocides in the lands between. And to be clear, as this term is often misunderstood, genocide does not require millions of deaths or the total extermination of an entire ethnic group. According to Article 2 of the United Nations Genocide Convention, genocide refers to any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. For one of these acts to qualify as genocide, in other words, it has to be paired with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a particular group of people. With that in mind, consider how the spoken echoes that linger in the mountaintops of the giants demonstrate Marika's genocidal intent.
In Marika's own words, "Hark, brave warriors. Hark, my lord Godfrey. We commend your deeds. Guidance hath delivered ye through each ordeal to the place ye stand. Put the giants to the sword and confine the flame atop the mount. Let a new epoch begin, an epoch glistening with life. Brandish the Elden Ring for the age of the Erdtree."
This clearly demonstrates that Marika's intent was to bring about the physical destruction of the giants, an act of genocide, which she frames as a precondition for the establishment of the Age of the Erdtree. Marika justifies this by waxing poetic about the Age of the Erdtree, which she claims will be an epoch glistening with life. Additional evidence of Marika's complicity in acts of genocide is concealed beneath the royal capital of Leyndell, at the base of the Erdtree, where we find the subterranean shunning grounds, wherein we happen upon an omen bairn, the item description for which reads in part, "Omen babies have all their horns excised, causing most to perish. These fetishes are made to memorialize them." Just as the physical destruction of the giants provided the metaphorical foundation for the Age of the Erdtree, the physical destruction of babies born with horns forms part of the literal foundation for the royal capital of Leyndell. When a child from the Erdtree's royal line is born with horns, their fate is only slightly less gruesome, as noted by the item description for the regal omen bairn, which reads in part, "Doll of a curse-born bairn from the Erdtree's royal line. Omen babies born of royalty do not have their horns excised, but instead are kept underground, unbeknownst to anyone, imprisoned for eternity. These memorial fetishes are fashioned in secret. This hints at the fate of two of Marika's own children, Morgott and Mohg, both of whom were born with horns, and were thus kept under the strictest confinement in the subterranean shunning grounds. By descending deeper still, we're confronted with evidence of yet another genocide for which Marika appears to have been directly or indirectly responsible, that of the nomadic merchants. Here, we find the nomadic merchant set, the item description for which reads in part, "These merchants once thrived as the Great Caravan, but after being accused of heretical beliefs, their entire clan was rounded up and buried alive far underground. Then they chanted a curse of despair and summoned the flame of frenzy." So it's clear in the base game that Queen Marika was directly or indirectly responsible for at least 3 genocides. Genocide is the most heinous, atrocious crime imaginable, the crime of crimes, and Marika has committed this crime at least 3 times. And that's without even accounting for the unconscionable treatment of other oppressed groups during the Age of the Erdtree, like the Misbegotten. As the item description for the winged Misbegotten Ashes explains, the Misbegotten are held to be a punishment for making contact with the Crucible, and from birth they are treated as slaves, or worse. Marika is also responsible for goading her own children into engaging in the deadly and ultimately pointless military conflicts that characterize the Shattering.
In Marika's own words, "Hear me, demigods. My children beloved, make of thyselves that which ye desire. Be it a lord, be it a god, but should ye fail to become aught at all, ye will be forsaken, amounting only to sacrifices."
I could go on and on and on, but I think the evidence is clear. Queen Marika is portrayed by the base game as an irredeemable, genocidal tyrant whose crimes are so heinous and so numerous that they cannot possibly be justified. The base game makes no effort to rationalize or justify Marika's crimes, and as best as I can tell, there was little debate in the community on this point, at least not until the DLC was released. In the story trailer for the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, we catch horrifying glimpses of yet another genocide for which Queen Marika is responsible, that of the people of the Tower, otherwise known as the Hornsent. Marika sent Mesmer to the realm of Shadow to subject its inhabitants to, as the trailer puts it, the tyranny of Mesmer's flame, by engaging in a purge without grace or honor, or, as the item description for Mesmer's armor explains, on his mother's wishes, Mesmer made himself a symbol of fear, undertaking the Cleansing Crusade she desired. This term, Cleansing Crusade, is not just a euphemism for genocide, but also for ethnic cleansing. Indeed, the item description for the Firespark perfume bottle notes that the crusade was a violent purge. This meant that, as the item description for the crusade insignia notes, the warriors who fought in the crusade set aside both honor and mercy to wantonly impale and scorch those deemed impure. Indeed, the landscape of the Realm of Shadow is charred and disfigured, and very few of its indigenous inhabitants remain. As the item description for the map of the gravesite plain explains, a somber plain covered in spirit graves. The spiral tower of the Hornsent lies to the northwest, and the entire expanse is marred by the harrowing ravages of war. It's interesting that this item describes the genocide of the Hornsent as a war. Likewise, the story trailer, which is narrated by Needle Knight Leda, describes it as a war unseen, one that could never be put to song. And yet, the visuals of the story trailer tell a very different story. To me, this looks like a slaughter of innocent civilians more than it does a military conflict. It's true that we see a divine dancing lion resisting Mesmer, but we're not shown any kind of coordinated military defense on the part of the Hornsent. This suggests, among other things, that the Hornsent were ill-prepared for this attack, and that they were left scrambling to defend themselves. That's consistent with the item description for the remembrance of the dancing lion, which reads in part, "When the Impaler's army assailed the tower, the ritual of the lion dance was turned toward martial ends, its divinity, its fury, its light-footed beauty." Despite being reserved for divine beast warriors who excel at divine invocation, the lion dance is clearly valued by the Hornsent as a cultural ceremony, not as a military instrument, as noted by the item description for the divine beast warrior armor. Among the divine beast warriors, only those who truly excel at divine invocation become sculpted keepers, and are granted the honor of the lion dance. This turned out more or less as you would expect. As we see in the story trailer, the item description for the divine beast Tornado explains, "The majority of divine beasts were gored and hung upon Mesmer's spears, then burned in his flame. Those who witnessed the deed likened it to a funeral pyre for the tower itself." The story trailer is narrated by Needle Knight Leda, so unsurprisingly, when we speak to her in-game, she frames the genocide of the Hornsent as a war that they just happened to lose.
Long ago, Queen Marika commanded Sir Mesmer to purge the Tower folk, a cleansing by fire. It's no wonder the Hornsent holds the Erdtree in contempt. That aside, man is by nature a creature of conquest, and in this regard the Tower folk are no different. They were never saints. They just happened to be on the losing side of a war, but it's still a wretched shame.
What does Leda mean when she suggests that the Hornsent weren't saints? It would seem that this is a reference to the genocide of the Shamans at the hands of the Hornsent. In Bonnie Village, the greater potentates wield a weapon called the Bonnie Butchering Knife, the description for which reads in part, "Weapon of the greater potentates of Bonnie Village, an outsized butcher's cleaver used to dismember human bodies in the making of the great jars stored in the jails." Additionally, in the whipping hut just outside of Bonnie Village, we find the Tooth Whip, the description for which reads, "Whip bestrewn with rotting, misshapen teeth, filthy and seething with disease. The teeth are embedded in the whip and dose the victim with deadly poison upon each strike. As the wounds ripen, they grow inflamed and ooze pus. The flesh of shamans was said to meld harmoniously with others." Next to the hut, we find a ghost NPC who says, "Ooh, for pity's sake, your place is in the jar. Nigh sainthood itself awaits you within. For shamans like you, this is your lot. Life were you accorded for this alone." In the nearby Bonnie jail, we find an item called Innard Meat, the description for which reads in part, "This is what becomes of the condemned, who get sliced up and stuffed into jars to become saints instead." The foregoing evidence paints a grim picture, indeed. It would seem that the Hornsent were dismembering the bodies of criminals and placing them into jars. Then they tortured shamans and threw them into the same jars. The tortured flesh of the shamans, who have particular physiological characteristics, functions as a sort of adhesive which binds together the numerous bodies contained within each jar. The stated intent of this process is to rehabilitate or redeem criminals by transforming them into saints. In the overwhelming majority of cases, however, this process produces abominations. Regardless of the Hornsent's stated intentions, we can infer intentions from their actions, and from that perspective, it's apparent that the shamans are victims of genocide. Just outside of Bonnie Village, we find this headless tree woman who teaches us the "O Mother" gesture. In the Shadow Keep, we find a developer message in front of a statue of Marika that reads, "Have mercy for the spirited away shamans." Using the "O Mother" gesture here reveals a hidden path to the hinterland, where we find a pair of tree sentinels guarding a seemingly innocuous path. This path leads to the Shaman village. As we approach the village, the standard open world theme is replaced with a rather somber track, hinting to the player that some great tragedy befell this place. Indeed, the village appears to have been abandoned long ago, and yet, as we enter the village proper, we find a patch of flowers basking in golden light and the minor Erdtree incantation, the description for which reads, "Secret incantation of Queen Marika, only the kindness of gold, without order," creates a small illusory Erdtree that continuously restores the HP of nearby allies. Marika bathed the village of her home in gold, knowing full well that there was no one to heal. This confirms not only that the village is long abandoned, but also that this was once Marika's home, that Marika is a shaman. Atop the hill, we find another tree woman, in front of whom we find an item called Golden Braid, the description for which reads in part, "A braid of golden hair cut loose, Queen Marika's offering to the grandmother. What was her prayer, her wish, her confession? There is no one left to answer, and Marika never returned home again." It seems clear what happened here, on the surface at least. Marika left her village for a time, and she returned to find that her village had been raided by Hornsent, and that all her fellow shaman had been spirited away, taken captive and tortured, so that they might serve as the biological and spiritual adhesive at the center of the Hornsent's misguided criminal rehabilitation program. Marika, devastated and enraged, resolved to avenge the genocide of the shamans, and it was this desire for vengeance that motivated her ascension to godhood. Framed in this manner, the genocide of the Hornsent appears as a sort of natural consequence of a cycle of genocidal violence. The Hornsent brutally oppressed and genocided the shamans, wiping out the shaman village in the process, leading inevitably to Marika's ascension to godhood and Messmer's genocidal Cleansing Crusade. This cycle persists by the time the player character reaches the realm of shadow, as evidenced by the vengeance-seeking Hornsent, who admits to the player character that he does not want to be redeemed by Mikola if redemption alleviates his desire for vengeance.
"In vengeance for the flames, my blade I wield. If Mikola's redemption soothes the ache that throbs within, demanding blessed vengeance, then I wish not to be by him redeemed."
What I've just presented is a surface-level interpretation of the lore revelations we just discussed. This is an interpretation that fails to stand up to scrutiny, as we'll see later on. For now, I want to take some time to discuss how the Elden Ring community reacted to these revelations. Please note that I'll be reading comments in this segment that include profanity. It must be said that the Elden Ring community is not a monolith. Indeed, the term community is something of a misnomer in this context, as the Elden Ring subreddit alone has more than 4 million users, and millions more have purchased the game. So, I want to be clear that when I speak in this segment of the Elden Ring community, my intention is not to generalize or to paint everyone with the same brush. Having said that, the posts and comments we're about to discuss are concerning to say the least, and not just because of their contents, but because of how they were received. These are not fringe comments that were downvoted into oblivion. In fact, many of these comments received hundreds of upvotes for celebrating the genocide of the Hornsent. So, while I'm undoubtedly talking in this segment about a particular cross-section of the Elden Ring community, it's the size of this cross-section that is concerning to me. Consider this post, titled, "The Hornsent are the Biggest Hypocrites," which was made to the Elden Ring subreddit on July 16th, 2024. This post has a net karma score of almost 9,000.
So, I basically just finished the DLC, and I honestly can't with the hypocrisy of the Hornsent. From the start of the DLC, you find a bunch of them crying about how they got unjustly put to the torch by Messmer, how they lived in peace and all that. Then you find out what they did to the shamans, the wiping hut, and all those grotesque pots under Bellyrat, as well as the ridiculously cruel punishment they imposed on Midra with barbs that pierced the people of the manse from within. Yeah, fuck them. I actually went full-blown frenzy flame on the Hornsent enemy NPCs after finding out about all the shit they did. Letta really put it best. They were never saints. They just found themselves on the losing side of a war. Still, it's mighty hypocritical of them to see themselves as these poor victims who never did anything wrong. Probably my favorite part of the writing in the DLC, if only because of how realistic it is with the way people from countries who subjugated others saw themselves after the tides of war turned against them.
Many of the comments on this post convey a similar message, in that they poke fun at and essentially celebrate the genocide of the Hornsent by referencing the atrocities committed by a subset of the Hornsent people, often to the tune of hundreds or thousands of upvotes. Some of the comments in this thread do at least attempt to engage seriously with the subject, even if this engagement is largely surface level. For example, several users argued that the key takeaway from the lore revelations in the DLC isn't that Marika's genocidal campaign against the Hornsent was justified, but that power corrupts and cycles of violence are pointless.
Miyazaki is all about institutions of power being corrupt regimes with oceans of blood on their hands. Just look at Gwyn's Age of Fire and the pile of dead dragons in the backyard. Elden Ring doubles down on it by reinforcing ideas of the cycle of hatred, and how one system comes to power by perpetrating the same crimes as the old one. The Hornsent were horrible. Marika's Golden Order was horrible. Miquella's Age of Compassion almost certainly would have been horrible. Don't let the name fool you. The Hornsent NPC is one of the best lessons in this. Yes, his people had horrible atrocities committed against them, and it's clear he intends to commit them right back against the lands between after Messmer's boss fight. Revenge never ends at just one dead man or one battle. People build power on a pile of corpses. It sucks that many people who played the DLC still have a black and white filter on. Base game, Marika bad, Omen good. DLC, Marika good, Hornsent bad. An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. Exactly this. Retribution via genocides is a ring that keeps perpetuating itself. Shatter the ring.
And then there's this post, which was the subject of the Icaros video I mentioned earlier. This post, which has a net karma score of more than 17,000, attempts to reframe the genocide of the Hornsent and the subsequent military occupation as heroic acts. Nothing justifies genocide, so this post is patently absurd and hardly worth discussing. But I want to address the suggestion that we should be applauding Messmer and his occupying forces for having built, quote, a huge library of documents and specimens for research and study, end quote. Because I've seen this very argument numerous times while conducting research for this video. Of course, this argument assumes that the specimen storehouse was built by the occupation and not the Hornsent themselves. I'm not sure where I stand on this, but let's assume, as this poster does, that the specimen storehouse was in fact built by the occupation. From this perspective, and I can't believe I even need to say this, but there's nothing valorous, noble, or ethical about committing genocide and then taxidermying your victims. The specimen storehouse is essentially a display case for trophies, but the trophies are dead Hornsent. This isn't meant to honor the Hornsent. It's no different than a recreational hunter who kills a moose and mounts its head on the wall of his living room. It's an assertion of humanity's dominion over nature. This is an even greater indignity when applied to indigenous peoples, as it conflates them with wild animals, dehumanizes them, and reduces them to mere savages or barbarians who cannot be civilized. And just so we're clear, this is a real thing. British museums are replete with the remains of indigenous peoples, among countless invaluable cultural artifacts pilfered from every corner of the British Empire. It wasn't until very recently that museums in Great Britain and elsewhere started to allow indigenous communities to repatriate the remains of their ancestors so that they might finally receive funerary rites. No matter the scientific value gained from hoarding these remains, and the evidence suggests that it was basically nil, as the overwhelming majority of these remains just sit around in storage. These horrendous practices are reflective of the most heinous excesses of imperialism. This is not something to celebrate. In reading the comments on this post, I started to notice a pattern, and the more threads I looked at, the more this pattern jumped out at me. In my reading of these threads, which were all broadly concerned with the question of whether Marika's genocide of the Hornsent was justified, the comments generally fell into one of 4 categories. In the first category, a disturbing number of users argued that Marika was justified in ordering the genocide of the Hornsent because of the atrocities the Hornsent committed against the Shamans. This category is exemplified by the following exchange. Note that each of these comments has a net karma score of at least 300.
Dude wears a mask made out of caterpillars. He's not exactly the type of guy you bump into at the laundromat. Why caterpillars, though? They ward off bad energies while you dismember and stuff people inside jars. Just Hornsent hobbies. Mesmer did nothing wrong. But he did though. He missed one. 2 if you count the grandma. The only thing Mesmer did wrong was he didn't finish the job.
The second category of comments frames the genocide of the Hornsent as part of a sort of natural cycle of violence and revenge. Human agency is limited on this view, as those mired within the cycle are seemingly unable to escape it. Consider, for instance, the following comment, in which a user argues that even though Marika was actually a good person, she had no choice but to commit genocide because of the things that happened to her within the cycle.
I think this is more a testament of how conflict and revenge is a cycle that draws people away from virtues and fairness. People like to shit on Marika for being a heartless god that paints herself as a saint, but the reality was that at some point in time, she was actually a good person. But the things she suffered through caused her to become a spiteful person, and made her into a terrible leader. Even if they were Hornsents with good intentions, the genocide to their race and their homes would have changed their minds or flat out killed them. Revenge is a cycle that never ends. The Hornsent story is just this.
The third category, nothing justifies genocide, but, overlaps with the first category in that these comments start by asserting that nothing justifies genocide, before proceeding to justify Marika's genocide of the Hornsent. Consider, for instance, the following comment.
Did an entire culture and race deserve to get wiped out? Probably not. Was said culture increasing the probability of their shit getting kicked in the moment someone rises to be powerful enough to challenge them? Also, yes. Can you blame Marika for reacting the way they did? Maybe, maybe not. Though grim as it may be, extreme retaliation is merely only one of the logical consequences of the extreme cruelty the Hornsent inflicted on her and her shaman people. Perhaps, in a way, it was the only justice Marika could be satisfied with, knowing the unspeakable cruelty the Hornsent did. Probably it was the only justice that could have occurred. The Hornsent were strong, and only Marika the goddess and her golden order could carry it out. What's worse, the Hornsent don't ever understand why Marika did it, only that she did. In this situation, Marika was victim, judge, jury, and executioner, all at once, and it changed her for the worse. She never had the chance to step back and process what the fuck just happened. One moment, she was just a girl, minding her own business with her people. The next, she's subjected to unspeakable cruelty, and she was doomed to live a horrifying experience. The next, she's a god, the vessel for the Elden Ring, and the head of the mighty Golden Order. In fact, the only pause she ever had in all this was when she left the gold hair braid in what was left of her village. Ain't no fucking way that's enough to heal from the hell the Hornsent put her through. It's just such a damn shame when you think about it. I'm rambling at this point, as I found myself emotional every time I had to clear a jail dungeon. Sorry if this doesn't make sense.
Consider also this comment, which also falls into the nothing justifies genocide but category, in which the user concedes that genocide is bad, but goes on to argue that Marika's genocidal rage actually humanizes her.
Stir-fry Hornsent in a furnace golem. Yeah, genocide bad, but I kind of find it funny that this was just straight up revenge by Marika. Kinda humanizing in a way, where it wasn't a war for conquest or to remove a potential threat. Marika just wanted them to suffer brutally for what they did to her people.
The fourth category, nothing justifies genocide, period, is pretty self-explanatory. These comments weren't nearly as common as I'd hoped they'd be.
Nothing ever justifies an all-consuming genocide. It also takes several leaps of logic to argue that every Hornsent across the fairly large continent of the Shadowlands deserved it. It's not like they were doing consensus voting for every single Hornsent.
So let's return to the first research question. How do we narrativize distant acts of violence? In my analysis of the Elden Ring community's response to the lore revelations found in the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, I identified 3 distinct approaches to narrativizing the genocide committed against the Hornsent. The first type of narrative is best summed up by the Latin phrase post hoc ergo propter hoc, which means after this, therefore because of this. In other words, the Hornsent committed atrocities against the shamans, and, in doing so, caused their own annihilation. This approach to narrativizing distant acts of violence is, of course, bereft of any semblance of nuance, and its validity in the eyes of its exponents depends in no small part on a surface-level engagement with the lore, not to mention a simplistic understanding of cause and effect. In this context, it's not terribly surprising to see that this type of narrative is most often transmitted through memes. These aren't so much narratives as they are punchlines, and so they need to be simple enough so that they're quickly understood. As a result, this type of narrative is far more likely to reinforce existing beliefs than they are to generate a meaningful understanding of distant acts of violence. If the first approach to narrativizing violence is a straight line from point A to point B, then the second and third approaches are represented by circles. Under the second approach, which we'll call the cycle of vengeance, violent acts committed by one side in a conflict are subsequently avenged by those on the opposing side. This act of vengeance is then met in turn with an act of vengeance from the other side, and so on in perpetuity. The cycle of vengeance is often, though not always, framed symmetrically, which is to say that both sides in the conflict are assumed to be equally villainous, equally powerful, and so on. Under the third approach, which we'll call the cycle of structural violence, distant acts of violence are understood as a consequence of structural forces, or the corrupting influence of power. These narratives occasionally overlap with the cycle of vengeance narratives, but with one key distinction. Whereas cycles of violence tend to subordinate human agency to a natural, cyclical predisposition towards violence, structural narratives run the risk of subordinating human agency to broader social or political forces that cannot easily be changed. In this respect, both the cyclical and structural narratives engender a sort of fatalism in which individuals and collectives fail to take action, owing to the pervasive belief that violence is inevitable. So even though these approaches to narrativizing distant acts of violence are capable of producing surface-level narratives that seem to be accurate, they're often missing key elements such as historical context for how the cycle came to be, and an understanding of the central role human agency can play in breaking the cycle. With all of this in mind, let's turn to our second case study, the genocide in Palestine. the previous segment, we discussed a number of comments that confidently and unapologetically justified Marika's genocide of the Hornsent and argued that the Hornsent got what they deserved. I found these comments so disturbing in part because of how closely they resembled the kind of comments that proliferated the internet following October 7th, 2023, in which users confidently and unapologetically justified Israel's genocide of Palestinians, whom they characterized as subhuman barbarians getting what they deserved.
Palestinians represent humanity in its most barbaric and primitive form. There's no place in the world for people like this. They commit/support atrocities on innocent Jews, then want us all to feel sorry for them when democracy pounds them into oblivion? They all got so used to Israel backing off, and some after each attack of the past. Now Israel and the majority of the world has finally grown tired of barbaric terrorism. You were given more than enough chances for peace, but you just can't leave people the fuck alone. You invited every bit of this chaos that is going to destroy you. Your homes, family, and way of is being decimated every minute. All because you lacked the courage to resist Hamas, the people who you were too scared to stand up to, so you just joined them/turned a blind eye. This is all because of you. Stop looking for our pity. You were asking all along for this collateral damage. You were all just too stupid to realize it. Keep crying, keep begging, just like the innocent men, women, and children did before they met their unjust demise at the hands of Hamas and primitive Palestinian people who allowed them to commit terrorism with impunity. You had every bit of this coming. Israel has every right to defend itself. Hamas carried out a horrendous massacre of civilians, including babies, children, women, and old people, and then hid with hostages among civilians in Gaza who cheered and clearly supported these killers and their acts. Yes, it sucks that children in Gaza have been killed, but that falls on Hamas for hiding behind civilians. The fact that over half of the people in Gaza and 42% in the West Bank support Hamas. Palestinian Arabs are the most radical population in the Middle East. They cause some trouble in Arab states as well. They are celebrating these atrocities around the world. They are conflating themselves. There may be parts of the population that are critical of Hamas, but there is no strict distinction. This is further demonstrated online, where supporters of Palestinian Arabs, instead of distancing themselves from such barbaric acts, readily justify these horrific crimes and blame the victims.
You could argue perhaps that these individuals were simply reacting out of shock at the events of October 7th, and that they're not actually calling for Palestinians to be genocided. On the contrary, I think what we're seeing here is that the mask has slipped. Prior to October 7th, it wasn't impossible to find people explicitly calling for Palestinians to be wiped out, but these comments weren't nearly as common as they are today. So, what happened on October 7th that so emboldened those with genocidal sentiments towards Palestinians to remove their masks entirely? Before I address this question, it's incumbent upon me to provide a legal disclaimer. This segment offers an historical and material discursive analysis of the events of October 7th, 2023. To be clear, this segment attempts to explain but does not justify, encourage, glorify, celebrate, or otherwise endorse acts of violence committed on, prior to, or following October 7th, 2023. The events of October 7th must be understood in the context of what Israeli historian Ilan Pappé has referred to as an incremental genocide against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Writing during Israel's 2014 attack on Gaza, Pappé explained as follows. In a September 2006 article for the Electronic Intifada, I defined the Israeli policy towards the Gaza Strip as an incremental genocide. Israel's present assault on Gaza, alas, indicates that this policy continues unabated. The term is important since it appropriately locates Israel's barbaric action, then and now, within a wider historical context. This context should be insisted upon, since the Israeli propaganda machine attempts again and again to narrate its policies as out of context, and turns the pretext it found for every new wave of destruction into the main justification for another spree of indiscriminate slaughter, in the killing fields of Palestine. So when Israel was attacked on October 7th, it wasn't attacked by Gazans, it was attacked by the victims of an incremental genocide 75 years in the making. It was attacked by refugees and the descendants of refugees who were ethnically cleansed from their lands in 1948 to pave the way for the birth of the State of Israel, a settler colonial ethnocracy premised not just on Jewish supremacy, but also the dehumanization of Palestinians. Palestinians refer to this event fittingly as the Nakba, or catastrophe, during which 750,000 Palestinians were forcibly displaced from their homes and never permitted to return. The Nakba was facilitated not just by Israel's British imperial benefactors, but also by the United Nations, whose 1947 partition plan divided Palestine into an Arab state and a Jewish state. This created a refugee crisis and destabilized the region, leading inevitably to military conflict with the neighboring Arab states. Following the War of 1967, which Israel won decisively, the map of the region looked like this, with the Israeli military occupying lands that stretched far beyond the boundaries established by the United Nations 20 years prior, including Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. At this point, Israel could have withdrawn their forces and allowed the Palestinians to establish their own state, but that option was never seriously considered. Israel wanted the land, but it's also an ethnocratic state, so it couldn't just grant citizenship and political rights to so many Palestinians, as that would have meant giving up its artificially manufactured Jewish demographic majority, thereby undermining the fundamental principle on which the state was founded, that is, Jewish supremacy. So, in the interest of maintaining a Jewish demographic majority, and by extension, Jewish domination over Palestine, Israel opted instead to subject Palestinians to a brutal, intrusive, all-encompassing military occupation that has persisted to our day. What does this mean in concrete terms? Palestinians are subject not to civilian law, but military law. This means that Palestinians as young as 12 can be arrested at any time for any reason, and they can be held indefinitely without charge. So even though the Western news media focused almost exclusively after October 7th on the plight of the 200-odd Israeli captives, we hear almost nothing about Palestinian captives who numbered in the thousands. In the occupied West Bank, Israel limits the growth of Palestinian villages by making it virtually impossible for them to obtain building permits. When Palestinians ignore this blatantly discriminatory system and construct new buildings anyway, Israeli authorities destroy them. Meanwhile, for decades, Israel has been expanding its West Bank settlements, which are illegal under international law. Massive walls separate these illegal settlements from adjacent Palestinian villages, cutting Palestinians off from their own land. Palestinians cannot use the same roads the Israelis do, and wherever they go, they must pass through military checkpoints, where they are profiled by invasive AI systems that are linked, in turn, to Israeli intelligence apparatuses. In other words, their movements are closely monitored and controlled. In villages occupied by Jewish settlers and Palestinians both, Palestinians are only permitted to walk or drive on certain streets. They are prohibited from entering certain areas, which are referred to as sterile areas, which are set aside exclusively for use by Israeli settlers. This is, to put it simply, a system of apartheid, in which the presumed supremacy of the Jewish people and the subhumanity of Palestinians is codified in Israeli law. Indeed, the 2018 Jewish nation-state law affirms that the right to national self-determination in the State of Israel is exclusive to the Jewish people. In Gaza, from which the IDF nominally withdrew its forces before Hamas rose to power in 2007, military occupation persists in a different form. In effect, Gaza is an open-air prison, subject to a military blockade and various forms of panoptic surveillance and control at the hands of the IDF. With crucial support from the American government and military-industrial complex, the IDF also periodically and indiscriminately bombs residential buildings and other civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, and mosques. They casually refer to these deadly, periodic bombing operations as mowing the lawn. This means that Palestinians in Gaza can't even imagine thriving, because they're preoccupied with merely surviving. Israel has been committing genocidal acts against Palestinians in Gaza for 3/4 of a century. It's worth noting that Israel is not solely responsible for these genocidal acts. Many, many others are complicit. For example, in addition to receiving critical diplomatic, economic, and military support from Western imperial powers like the United States, Great Britain, and Germany, Israel receives significant financial, technological, and logistical support from transnational capital interests. Israel has constructed economies of apartheid and genocide, and participation in these economies has been tremendously lucrative for many transnational corporations, including tech companies like Microsoft, Cisco, Google, and HP, among others. In other words, Palestinians are oppressed not just by Israel, but by a vast network of state and non-state actors in Israel and elsewhere who are driven by an imperial mindset, the desire to accumulate capital, or both. It's no wonder that Palestinians sometimes feel like the world is against them. It was in this context that Palestinian resistance fighters attacked Israel on October 7th. In the West, this history of dispossession, military occupation, colonial violence, apartheid, and genocide has been intentionally obscured in favor of a distorted reality in which history started on October 7th. On this view, there was no precedent for the violent acts committed by Palestinian resistance fighters on October 7th. No dispossession, colonialism or ethnic cleansing, no system of apartheid, no military occupation, no incremental genocide. Only acts of terror committed in a vacuum. And therein lies the discursive trick that Israel has used to justify its shift from an incremental genocide to a full-blown genocide. Namely, to frame October 7th as a terrorist attack motivated exclusively by genocidal anti-Semitism, to use a hypothetical genocide to justify an actual genocide. So, if October 7th wasn't an act of genocide motivated by anti-Semitism, then what was it? For an in-depth answer to this question, I recommend checking out a video essay called The Gaza Ghetto Uprising by a YouTuber named Adi Kalai, as well as an excellent Al Jazeera documentary simply titled October 7th. I'll leave links to both videos in the description below. Prior to October 7th, as we just established, Palestinians in Gaza have been subject to an incremental genocide since 1948. As the noose around their collective necks tightened with each passing decade, Palestinians increasingly engaged in violent and non-violent acts of resistance, in an attempt not just to improve their material conditions, but also to assert their collective right to self-determination. While many of these acts of resistance proved ineffective, Palestinian resistance fighters found that they could extract significant concessions from the Israeli government by capturing IDF soldiers and negotiating favorable terms in prisoner exchange agreements. In 2006, for example, Palestinian resistance fighters used a tunnel to escape the Gaza Strip and attack an IDF military base, where they took down a tank and captured its gunner, a corporal named Gilad Shalit. The resistance later released Shalit in order to secure the release of more than 1,000 people being held in Israeli prisons. Remember that Palestinians have virtually no rights in the Israeli legal system, so it's likely that many of these individuals would otherwise have died in Israeli prisons for crimes they may not have even committed. Palestinians in the Gaza Strip have been subject to a suffocating military blockade since 2007, in which the Israeli government calculated the absolute minimum amount of calories Palestinians in the Gaza Strip would need to not starve, and then converted this figure into daily aid truck deliveries. Then, Israel allowed even fewer aid trucks into the Gaza Strip than was suggested by their own formula, slowly starving Palestinians in the process. And this is just one example of the many ways that Israel deliberately inflicts on Palestinians in the Gaza Strip conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction. In other words, this is just one aspect of Israel's incremental yet accelerating genocide against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. All the while, the world watched and did nothing. Colonialism is, as Frantz Fanon argued, inherently violent, and for this reason, the one language colonizers understand unequivocally is that of violence. It follows for Fanon that violent resistance may represent a prerequisite to decolonization. The violence which has ruled over the ordering of the colonial world, which has ceaselessly drummed the rhythm for the destruction of native social forms and broken up without reserve the systems of reference of the economy, the customs of dress and external life, the same violence will be claimed and taken over by the native at the moment when, deciding to embody history in his own person, he surges into the forbidden quarters. It was in this context that the Palestinian resistance carried out what it called Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. In the early morning of October 7th, 2023, resistance fighters used commercial drones to disable the surveillance towers that dot the fence erected to keep Palestinians confined to the Gaza Strip. With the towers disabled, fighters surged into the forbidden quarters and attacked the military bases lining the fence, where they expected to meet significant resistance from Israeli forces. However, the IDF was caught completely off guard. Its bases were quickly overrun, and the soldiers stationed there were killed or taken captive. It's important to understand that the Palestinian resistance is not a monolith. Operation Al-Aqsa Flood was led by the Al-Qassam Brigades, which is the armed wing of Hamas, but a number of additional armed resistance factions participated in the attack, including Saraya al-Quds, the National Resistance Brigades, and the Mujahideen Brigades, among others. Although each of these groups is committed to resistance against Israel, they have differing understandings of the form that resistance ought to take. So, when the IDF's Gaza division failed to put up a fight, resistance fighters moved on to the nearby settlements, followed shortly thereafter by Palestinian civilians. In other words, what was initially a carefully planned operation had become a popular uprising. Remember that Israel didn't just imprison Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, it's been slowly starving them for years. It was in this context that hundreds of Palestinian civilians poured through the fence and headed for the nearby settlements, where many stole food and other items. At this point in the operation, many Israeli soldiers and civilians were being taken back to the Gaza Strip, where they were to be held captive and exchanged for Palestinian prisoners. In an apparent panic, the IDF activated the Hannibal Directive. The Hannibal Directive was introduced by the IDF in the mid-1980s to prevent, at any cost, Israeli soldiers and civilians from being taken captive. In other words, the IDF authorized the use of lethal force against its own people. That such an authorization exists at all is troubling, as it means Israel would rather kill its own citizens than cede to Palestinians any amount of leverage or power that they might use to advance their national liberation movement. And so, the IDF's Apache helicopters fired indiscriminately at anyone and everyone moving towards Gaza, killing an untold number of Palestinians and Israelis in the process. Meanwhile, IDF tanks were shelling houses in the nearby settlements because they suspected resistance fighters were inside, which, again, resulted in the deaths of both Palestinians and Israelis. For this reason, it's impossible to say how many of the 1,200 casualties were killed by the resistance and how many were killed by the IDF. What is clear is that many of those 1,200 casualties were civilians, including those attending the Nova Music Festival, being held not far from the so-called Gaza security fence. It's evident that Palestinian resistance fighters weren't expecting to find a music festival mere steps away from their prison cell, and they reacted to that surprise with force. Resistance is messy. Armed resistance? Doubly so. And yet, in the days and weeks that followed, the discourse in the West was concerned not with legitimate questions about the messy, unintended consequences associated with armed resistance against ethnic cleansing, apartheid, and genocide, but with unspeakable atrocities committed by cartoonishly evil terrorists. In other words, to paraphrase the Al Jazeera documentary mentioned earlier, the focus in the media wasn't on the crimes committed by the resistance, but on the crimes they didn't commit, as Israel and its allies relentlessly spread atrocity propaganda in a transparent attempt to justify the acceleration of its genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. Israel pointed to charred, melted bodies found in the aftermath of the attack and claimed that Palestinians had beheaded or burned babies alive. These claims were uncritically echoed by Western reporters and politicians. It wasn't until later that it became clear that this was the handiwork of IDF tanks shelling houses in Israeli settlements. Despite this revelation, Western reporters and politicians not only failed to issue retractions, they continued to parrot blatant lies about fictional Israeli babies to justify the wholesale slaughter of actual Palestinian babies. Israel also claimed that Palestinians committed systematic acts of sexual violence on October 7th, and that Palestinian resistance fighters had been ordered to use sexual assault as a weapon of war. Again, despite the absence of any compelling evidence to support these claims, Western media outlets like the New York Times rushed to publish articles that furthered this narrative. Perhaps they believed that the evidence was forthcoming, but no such evidence materialized. Here too, no retractions were issued, and Israeli atrocity propaganda came to be treated as unassailable evidence that Palestinians, as a people, were beyond saving, that they had to be put down, like rabid dogs. I could go on and on about the many lies Israel continues to tell about what happened on October 7th, but I think you get the point. Operation Al-Aqsa Flood was an act of resistance against ethnic cleansing, apartheid, and genocide, and an extremely successful one at that. It was so successful that it embarrassed and enraged the most technologically advanced military in the world. Although Israel's reaction to this humiliation has been principally motivated by genocidal rage, it also saw in this defeat opportunity. The opportunity to manufacture consent for the acceleration of its genocide against Palestinians in Gaza, and atrocity propaganda has played a central role in Israel's attempt to seize this opportunity. This approach to manufacturing consent is virtually as old as colonialism itself. Indeed, as Paulo Freire argued in the mid-20th century, it is always the oppressed who are disaffected, who are violent, barbaric, wicked, or ferocious when they react to the violence of the oppressors. Palestinian-American scholar Edward Said explained this approach to manufacturing consent through his theory of Orientalism, which refers to the material discursive processes through which Western imperial powers construct the so-called Orient as fundamentally inferior to the West. I should note that my previous Elden Ring video essay includes a detailed explanation of this understanding of discourse, so if you're unclear about anything I'm about to say, I suggest checking that video out. Put simply, discourse is not just talk and text. It produces material effects on the world around us. In the present context, for example, discourse doesn't just cause or facilitate violence against Palestinians, it also obscures this violence, as Mohammed El-Kurd, a Palestinian writer, poet, and journalist, explains. I am often asked if I want to throw Israelis into the sea. My answer has become increasingly facetious, even flippant. If they are so afraid of drowning, why don't they learn how to swim? Sometimes I get gasps, occasionally a muffled snicker, and other times unabridged laughter. After the joke comes the thesis. Such questions are the red herrings and strawman fallacies asked in bad faith. I obviously believe in freedom and dignity for all. Those asking, what happens to the settlers, have not once thought about the fate of the 6 million Palestinian refugees agonizing in exile. This is not so much a polemic but an observation, a fatigued observation, reiterated incessantly. Such distracting questions feed the discursive loop that prioritizes the settler's theoretical future over our material present that is already marked with extermination. As a result of these material discursive processes, the West is understood to be active, progressive, rational, democratic, and peaceful, whereas the East is dismissed as passive, backwards, superstitious, authoritarian, and violent. These oppositions don't conform to reality, but they nevertheless come to serve as the basis for Western domination over the East. In some cases, these discursive formulations are subtle. For example, Palestinian resistance fighters are not soldiers like the Israelis who are enlisted in the IDF. They're terrorists. Along similar lines, Palestinians captive in Israel are referred to as prisoners, if they're even mentioned at all, whereas Israeli captives are referred to as hostages, even if they were captured while actively serving in the IDF. Since October 7th, however, these discursive formulations have become increasingly more explicit, with top Israeli officials referring to Palestinians as human animals, or framing their genocidal campaign as one that pits civilization against barbarism. And yet, this campaign has proven enormously successful in manufacturing consent for its genocidal campaign against Palestinians. This has also had the effect of emboldening many on the right to remove their masks.
They have genocide built into Sharia law right now. So no, I'm not going to cry a fucking river when people who have genocide that's baked into their laws are getting genocided. I don't give a fuck. They're terrible people. These people are not your allies. They are not the same as us. They come from an inferior culture that is horrible. It kills people for their identity, and it is directly antithetical to everything Western values stand for, and it is an inferior culture in all ways.
So it's apparent that this guy has no idea what he's talking about. He doesn't know the first thing about Islam, or Palestinian culture, or the history of the region. And yet he felt compelled not just to comment on the genocide in Gaza, but to celebrate it. How do we explain this? This is not just about morals or ethics on an individual level. This is broader than Israel as well. This is about imperialism. Indeed, I think the reason Israel's atrocity propaganda campaign was so successful is that it leaned so heavily into the imperial mindset. Maori scholar Linda Tui Smith defines imperialism broadly as the system of ideas and practices which together justify and support the domination and control of one people by another. Colonialism, on this view, is imperialism's outpost, the fort and the port of imperial outreach, and a particular realization of the imperial imagination. So, in the aftermath of October 7th, Israel, which functions as a US imperial outpost in the Middle East, directly appealed to the imperial mindset of Westerners in general, and Americans in particular, encouraging them to unmask themselves to stand with Israel, to support the civilized Israeli soldiers as they commit genocide against the barbaric, subhuman Palestinians. And by and large, the West has done exactly that, revealing in the process the extent to which the imperial imagination continues to function as the driving force of Western societies. Before we turn back to Elden Ring, let's address our research questions once again. How do we narrativize violence in occupied Palestine? And what are the material effects associated with these approaches? In the West, the most prevalent approaches to narrativizing violence in occupied Palestine are largely consistent with our previous case study. That is, most mainstream accounts of the genocide employ the post hoc approach to explaining it, in which Israel is merely responding to the events of October 7th, which occurred in a vacuum. From this perspective, in other words, nothing justifies October 7th, but October 7th justifies everything. Consistent with the previous case study, this approach to narrativizing the genocide depends in no small part on a surface-level engagement with the history of the region, and this has the material effect of reinforcing existing beliefs about the same. It's also sometimes said that violence in occupied Palestine is cyclical. There are many different versions of this argument. In an earlier version of this video essay, for instance, I argued as follows. The tragic irony in all of this is that the State of Israel was ostensibly created as a safe haven for the Jewish people, who had long been persecuted and subject to anti-Semitism in Europe, culminating in the Holocaust, during which 6 million Jews were exterminated. It's understandable, of course, that the Jewish people would experience an overwhelming sense of existential anxiety in the aftermath of the Holocaust. In seeking a refuge from oppression and genocide, however, the people of Israel became the perpetrators of oppression, and later, of genocide. In the process, Israel has mired itself in a state of perpetual violent conflict, and this conflict will persist for as long as Zionists try to gaslight the world into forgetting that their nation was founded on land violently stolen from Palestinians. Although many such narratives correctly identify the prime mover of the cycle, namely the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, this crucial context tends to be obscured by the very concept of a cycle. For many, this concept is inextricably tied to natural phenomena. When pondering the hydrological cycle, for instance, we don't often stop to consider how it began, or indeed, how it will end. For this reason, any approach to narrativizing violence that revolves around cycles will run the risk of engendering a sort of fatalism, in which we mistakenly assume that violence is a state of nature, and we become desensitized to it. This is why Israel-Palestine is so often depicted as an intractable conflict, for which there is no realistic resolution. This applies to all variations of this approach, of which there are many. There's the narrative which suggests that both Palestinians and Israelis think that the land between the river and the sea was promised to them by God. In this context, both sides have the divine right to commit violent acts against each other, which ensures that the cycle of violence perpetuates itself over and over and over again. Then, there's the narrative which suggests that Muslims in general, and Palestinians in particular, are inherently anti-Semitic, and that they're somehow genetically predisposed to committing acts of violence against Jews. From this perspective, Palestinians attack Israelis because that's just what they do, and when Israelis respond with violence, they are, rather conveniently, just engaging in self-defense. This lends itself to problematic ahistorical narratives, which depict Muslims and Jews as fated to remain deadlocked in violent exchanges with one another for all of eternity. More recently, I've seen a growing number of narratives which emphasize the role that trauma plays in perpetuating the cycle of violence, and I'm sure there are many additional varieties of this narrative that I've not addressed here. Regardless of the contents of the cyclical narrative, they all share the same fundamental flaws, as previously noted. They obscure asymmetrical power dynamics and historical context, and subordinate human agency to a natural, cyclical predisposition towards violence. Most critically, however, they fail to account for the possibility of a permanent resolution to the underlying conflict, of a way to break the cycle. If, as I've argued, the cycle is an inadequate framing device for understanding distant acts of violence, what's the alternative? In the context of Israel-Palestine, violence occurs in spirals. Unlike the Hornsent, who conceptualize spirals as a normalized crucible current that, one day, will form a column that stretches to the gods, spirals of violence descend from an historical rupture point. In this way, the spiral addresses one of the fundamental problems with the cycle, as it's grounded in historical context. Additionally, whereas the cycle subordinates human agency to violence as a state of nature, the spiral creates and maintains space for historical contingency, which is to say that it leaves open the possibility that the violence can end. Each loop in the spiral ends with an inflection point, which represents an opportunity either to address the root cause of the conflict, thus ending the spiral, or to double down and continue the downward spiral. In the context of Israel-Palestine, the spiral descends from the Nakba of 1948, when Zionist paramilitary groups violently displaced 750,000 Palestinians, massacring many of them in the process, and destroying more than 400 Palestinian villages. This led, inevitably, to resistance from Palestinians intent on returning to and reclaiming their lands and homes. From 1987 to 1993, for example, Palestinians engaged in widespread, non-violent protests, boycotts, and acts of civil disobedience in what would later become known as the First Intifada, as Palestinian-American historian Rashid Khalidi explains. The Intifada was a spontaneous bottom-up campaign of resistance, born of an accumulation of frustration and initially with no connection to the formal political Palestinian leadership. As with the 1936-39 revolt, the Intifada's length and extensive support was proof of the broad popular backing that it enjoyed. The uprising was also flexible and innovative, developing a coordinated leadership while remaining locally driven and controlled. Among its activists were men and women, elite professionals and business people, farmers, villagers, the urban poor, students, small shopkeepers, and members of virtually every other sector of society. Along with demonstrations, the Intifada involved tactics ranging from strikes, boycotts, and withholding taxes to other ingenious forms of civil disobedience. Protests sometimes turned violent, often ignited by soldiers inflicting heavy casualties with live ammunition and rubber bullets, used against unarmed demonstrators or youths throwing stones. Nevertheless, the uprising was predominantly non-violent and unarmed, a crucially important factor that helped mobilize sectors of society, in addition to the young people protesting in the streets, while showing that the entirety of Palestinian society under occupation opposed the status quo and supported the Intifada. This led to an inflection point as word of Palestinian resistance spread across the globe, forcing imperial powers, along with the rest of the world, to decide whether or not to intervene. Rather than standing up for Palestinians and asserting their collective right to return to their homes, the imperial powers doubled down on their support for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and the subsequent military occupation by establishing, through the Oslo Accords, a Vichy-esque collaborator regime in the form of the Palestinian Authority. This escalated the problem, giving rise to the next loop in the spiral, which started in the year 2000 with the Second Intifada. Having failed during the First Intifada, which was mostly non-violent, to rouse the world into action, Palestinians increasingly turned, during the Second Intifada, to violent acts of resistance. You might think that this would have led someone, anyone, in the international community to not just recognize the horrendous injustices to which Palestinians have been subjected at the hands of Israel and its imperial benefactors, but to do something, anything, about those injustices. Once again, the world watched and did nothing. And so, the downward spiral continued, resulting in many additional acts of resistance, including Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. But each act of resistance has been met with an increasingly genocidal response by the Israeli state and the IDF. Although Palestinians in Gaza continue to steadfastly persevere, against all odds, their future remains uncertain, as the genocide enters a new phase. Despite the so-called ceasefire agreement signed in August 2025, Palestinians are still dying every single day at the hands of the IDF. The need for food and shelter is still nothing short of dire for hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza. Even though Israel agreed to lift its blockade as part of the ceasefire agreement, the blockade persists. And then there's the so-called Board of Peace. And at this rate, I worry that it's only a matter of time until, well, you know. That is, unless a critical mass of international actors decides to intervene by asserting, at minimum, that Palestinians have the right to self-determination, that they have the right to return to their lands and their homes, and by demanding the creation of a single democratic state between the river and the sea, in which all citizens, including Palestinians and Israelis, have equal rights. As we've seen, however, it's unlikely that this will happen anytime soon, and the reason for that, I think, is fairly obvious. Namely, Western nations refuse to acknowledge and contend with the reality of what's happening in Palestine, because that would require them to acknowledge and contend not just with their own cultures of imperialism, but also their histories of colonialism and genocide. To acknowledge, for instance, that Israelis live on lands violently stolen from Palestinians, and that Israel secured this land theft by committing genocide against Palestinians, nation-states like Canada would have to truly reckon with the fact that they too live on lands violently stolen from indigenous peoples, and that they too live in societies founded through genocide. This would require addressing difficult questions like, how can we achieve justice for victims of ethnic cleansing and genocide under capitalism, an economic system that is premised on precisely that kind of dispossession? Needless to say, we don't seem to have much of an interest in engaging in those kinds of difficult conversations. In one of the many Reddit threads I reviewed over the course of making this video, I came across an apt comment by a Redditor named Anonymous Murphy, which reads as follows. Like all good art, Elden Ring ends up being more revelatory about the people who experience it than the people who made it. Unfortunately, we live in a world that never truly contended with its own legacy of colonialism, exploitation, and genocide, so those types of attitudes are more deeply embedded in people's psyches than they realize. I think the goal of any artist grappling with such themes is to get their audience to reflect on their own biases and attitudes, but sadly, the exact opposite happens just as often. People will reinterpret art intended to challenge, and use it to justify whatever beliefs they already held. In my opinion, it's this reach of imperialism into our minds that's most concerning. Mi'kmaq scholar Marie Baptiste refers to this as cognitive imperialism. This helps to explain why so many people were willing to justify the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza based on Israel's post-October 7th atrocity propaganda. This also helps to explain why so many in the Elden Ring community were willing to justify the genocide of the Hornsent based on a surface-level interpretation of the lore from the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, in which Marika's genocide of the Hornsent was not just a straightforward revenge story, but also a totally justified one. According to this interpretation, as I've argued, the Hornsent committed genocide against the Shamans, thus motivating Marika's subsequent ascension to godhood and genocide of the Hornsent. Genocide is the crime of crimes, and, as I've argued, it can never be justified, not even to avenge another genocide. Nevertheless, it's worth noting that this interpretation of the DLC's lore simply falls apart when subjected to scrutiny. To explain what I mean, I'm going to be quoting extensively in this segment from a wonderful essay posted to Medium by a user named Mirko. The essay, which is titled The Seduction and the Betrayal of How Marika Betrayed the Shamans to Become a God, is linked in the video description below, and I highly recommend you check it out, because it's an incredibly thoughtful and well-researched essay, and I'm only going to be quoting excerpts from the conclusion, which is but a small fraction of the overall essay. Without further ado, Mirko writes, the Elden Ring community tends to paint Marika as the traumatized avenger of her tribe's massacre at the hands of the Hornsent, but in doing so, it often overlooks some details that, if included into the discussion, would strongly undermine this romantic interpretation of the goddess's past. For example, it is quite strange that Mesmer's crusade against the Hornsent only began long after the foundation of Leyndell and the creation of the Erdtree, as evidenced by the description of the Fire Knight set. At that time, Marika had already achieved a considerable level of power. She had found her own Elden Lord, gathered an army ready to fight in her name, conquered the hearts of thousands of people through the blessed fruits of her golden tree, and created a class of nobles willing to support her empire. Yet, for a long time, Bellirat continued to exist undisturbed. Indeed, as Mirko goes on to note, Marika went on to lead at least 4 military campaigns, and may have even removed the Rune of Death from the Elden Ring before ordering Messmer to wipe out the Hornsent. In light of this, Mirko continues, it seems highly implausible that Marika deliberately waited so long to enact her supposed revenge against the Hornsent. The argument that Marika had other enemies to defeat before turning to her personal vengeance does not hold up at all, especially considering that even after Messmer's crusade began, regions like Liurnia, Limgrave, and Caelid still remained to be conquered. In fact, the more we examine the information provided by the game, the clearer it becomes that the Tower Folk and the government of Leyndell were not enemies at first, but allies. Both Hornsent Grandum and the Hornsent following Miquella describe Messmer's crusade and the concealment of their region through the Scatter Tree as a betrayal by Marika. And once again, you have to trust someone to be betrayed. A closer analysis of the lore in the Shadow of the Erd Tree reveals several clues confirming the existence of an alliance between Leyndell and Bellurat, starting with the churches of Marika found in the Land of Shadow. Their construction is often attributed to Messmer and his crusaders, yet one can be found within the Abyssal Woods, a forbidden place sealed off by the Hornsent long before Messmer's invasion. The presence of this abandoned church in a restricted area contradicts the idea that these structures were built during the Crusade, and leads to an intriguing conclusion. These churches were erected within Bellurat's territory at a time when no conflict existed, serving as tangible proof of a peaceful coexistence between the Hornsent's upper class and the worship of Marika. Further evidence of this coexistence between the two realms is the shared use of Crucible, wielded by both the warriors of Bellurat through spiral incantations, and by the warriors of Leyndell through Crucible and Erdtree incantations. Even the armor of the Crucible Knights features the spiral on its tunic, highlighting the cultural exchange between the two societies. Mirko also notes that there is no shortage of evidence suggesting that Marika gifted to the Hornsent shards of the Elden Ring. The Inquisitors of Bellurat wield candles and torture instruments made of a material that visibly resembles the gold of the Elden Ring. In particular, the shape of one of their candles bears a strong resemblance to a rune arc. A curious coincidence, no doubt, given that this consumable can be found on one of the altars in Enir-Ilim. There is no evidence that Bellurat possessed the Elden Ring before Marika's arrival and her divine ascension. If that were the case, if they already had the source of their worshipped crucible in their hands, the Hornsent would hardly have sought to reach divinity by building a tower that aimed to reach the skies. The most reasonable explanation is that the Hornsent obtained some fragments of the ring by Marika herself when she turned into a god, leading to the logical conclusion that Marika shared parts of the Elden Ring with them, from which the Inquisitors crafted their thorns and candlesticks. The most compelling evidence that Marika was allied with the Hornsent, Mirko goes on to argue, is to be found in the fact that she was able to access the Divine Gate. Messmer's crusade began long after Marika's ascension, which means the goddess did not reach the gate atop Enir-Ilim by herself, or through sheer force. To do so, she would have had to overcome all the Hornsent warriors and break through the strict security of Enir-Ilim's tower, an almost impossible feat, even if she had been escorted by Malekith. Furthermore, as Ansbach states, the existence of the Divine Gate was a closely guarded secret, evidently known only to the highest ranks of Bellurat. If Marika was able to use the gate, it implies that she was one of the few who knew about its existence, and therefore, her access must have been explicitly granted by the leaders of Bellurat. If that is the case, then a crucial question arises. Why did the Hornsent grant Marika, a humble and hornless shaman, permission to access Bellurat's most sacred site and, more importantly, the opportunity to ascend to the role of goddess of the lands between? It must be remembered that the Hornsent considered themselves the chosen people because of their horns, which they saw as undeniable proof of their divine nature above everyone else. This belief justified, at least in their eyes, the atrocities they committed against other peoples, including the shamans, whom they would later use as a key ingredient for their living jars. And yet, they granted Marika an unprecedented privilege. Why? Because Marika was an Empyrean. This is important, as Mirko explains, because the divinity of the Crucible had long eluded the Hornsent. And so, when Marika came along, backed by her own two fingers and, by extension, the Greater Will, the Hornsent were easily seduced by the prospect of finally reaching the Crucible. Mirko continues, We do not know the details of her meeting with the high ranks of Belurat, but Marika undoubtedly presented herself as the one who would bring their ambitions to fruition. Her claims validated by the presence of Malekith at her side and the words of the two fingers that guided her. Of course, she was a humble shaman, a hornless being whom they deemed inferior. But how could the leaders of the tower refuse such an offer from an Empyrean supported by the fingers that heralded the desires and the words of the greater will? The Hornsent needed her. Of course, Marika also needed the Hornsent, as Mirko goes on to explain. What made the Hornsent indispensable allies in Marika's goal was their territorial influence. Belurat had slaves, lands, prisons in every region, and an overwhelming military force. With all of that, the Tower folk could have easily provided Marika with the required means for her ascension. And what did she need to ascend? Runes in vast quantities, and thus bodies, many bodies, from which to extract those precious runes. On her own, not even with Malekith's help, Marika could not have caused such carnage, but the Hornsent could. The continent's greatest power at the time could have easily given her all the corpses she needed, from slaves to prisoners, and used them to build the gate that could bring her to heavens, where the gods resided. Using this gate, the Divine Gate, Marika became a vessel for the Elden Beast, and with her newfound powers, she would go on to establish the Golden Order. This Golden Order, as Mirko goes on to argue, was built atop the unimaginable suffering of her people, the Shamans. Although the game does not present any description or dialogue that openly confirms Marika's betrayal of her tribe, all the evidence points to this interpretation. After all, the Hornsent sacrificed every shaman they found in their rituals, believing that this was their ultimate purpose, as stated by the spirit of a torturer from Bonny Village. Yet, while all of them met such a cruel fate, Marika was surprisingly spared and even supported by the Hornsent in her path to ascension, precisely because of her nature as an Empyrean. It is evident that Marika and the Hornsent were allies, and this implies that Marika was fully aware of the fate that would befall her sisters. If she wanted to, she could have stopped them, proposed another option, warned the shamans of the impending threat, or at least stationed Malekith to defend the village. Even after she veiled the Hornsent region in her Scadu tree, she chose not to retrieve her tortured sisters from the jails, to soothe their pain or save them. Instead, the Hornsent marched to the various villages and abducted the shamans one by one, while the Empyrean patiently awaited the day she would claim the Elden Ring, standing in front of the Divine Gate. One could argue perhaps that Marika was under duress, that the Hornsent forced her to ascend to godhood at the expense of her own people. Mirko contends that this interpretation also runs counter to the evidence, reiterating in the process that, after her ascension, Marika had all the time and means necessary to exact her revenge, yet she did nothing until the removal of the Rune of Death. She instead slaughtered the giants and established an age of abundance where she, her family, and her kingdom literally chilled out, enjoying the benefits of the sap produced by the Erd Tree. This is not the behavior of a woman seeking revenge, but of a calculating individual who did everything to reach the top and stay there. Marika betrayed for power, seduced by the possibility of sitting on the throne of the world, as her two fingers foresaw for her. A humble shaman like her would have no other chance to achieve such a goal. The cost of achieving this goal was, of course, staggering. In order for Marika to achieve this goal, shamans had to be brutally tortured in order to activate the latent adhesive quality of their flesh, which would then be used as a binding agent to construct and sustain the Divine Gate. Horrifyingly, these shamans lived throughout this process, and were probably even still alive by the time the player character ascended to the Divine Gate, as Mirko explains. The shamans we fight inside the jails are still alive, even if consumed by the swollen mass of flesh attached to their bodies. This detail highlights a subtle yet crucial point. After all these years, even in their horrifying state, the shamans are still alive. This is a fundamental detail in explaining why, even after Marika's ascension, the Divine Gate can still be used by other Empyreans. The portal erected with those countless bodies still has a living, pulsating core within it, and therefore can still produce and contain the required runes to permit ascension. This is how Miquella becomes a god, even after his mother has already exploited the power of the gate. it would undoubtedly be the Hornsent's masterpiece were it not for the fact that this revelation leads us to a bitter and heartbreaking conclusion. The shamans are still alive within that gate. Whether conscious or not, they remain in a state of eternal agony, even after the divine gate has calcified. It's no wonder, then, that Marika felt the need to confess when returning to her village many years later, as Mirko goes on to conclude. It was this dark and sorrowful truth that Queen Marika confessed before the remains of her grandmother when she returned to her birthplace years after her ascension. The description of the Golden Braid tells us the Queen spoke a prayer, a wish, and a confession to her former tribe leader. And while it is easy to interpret the prayer as an act honoring her shaman sisters, and the wish as a hope for the future of her children and bloodline, the term confession raises many questions. Questions that find immediate answers when we consider Marika's betrayal of her own clan. The fact that the goddess felt the need to confess such a sin to her grandmother implies that none of the shamans knew the real reason for their persecution. One day, the Hornsent walked into their villages, took them away, and subjected them to a fate worse than death. And they never knew why this happened. But now, it is all just a distant memory, a story of seduction and betrayal, hidden in the shadow of the Erd Tree. Contrary to the post hoc interpretation of these events, in which Marika somehow eluded the fate that befell her fellow shamans, infiltrated Enir-Ilim, reached the Divine Gate, ascended to godhood, and then, in a genocidal rage, ordered Mesmer to exterminate the Hornsent, it's apparent that Marika was directly involved in the Hornsent's genocide of the shamans. More than that, she maintained an alliance with the Hornsent for many years after she ascended to godhood. With this context in mind, the post hoc interpretation of the DLC's lore is simply incomprehensible. Indeed, Marika and the Hornsent were jointly responsible for the genocide of the shamans, so her subsequent genocide of the Hornsent must have been chiefly motivated by something other than a desire to avenge the shamans. Perhaps the Hornsent, along with the Realm of Shadow more broadly, had become too much of an inconvenience for Marika. Perhaps she didn't want anyone else to ascend to godhood, out of fear that such an individual might prove capable of challenging her reign. So, she sent Mesmer to cleanse the Hornsent from the Realm of Shadow, which she then sealed off from the rest of the lands between, thereby rendering the Divine Gate inaccessible, at least until Miquella came along. From the outset, Marika has always been driven by a desire not just to acquire power, but to hold on to that power at any cost. And although the item description for the Golden Braid suggests that she felt some remorse for what she did to her own people, she clearly didn't care enough to do something, anything, to alleviate the unimaginable suffering of the surviving shamans. Marika is, and always has been, an absolute monster. That should have been clear to anyone who's seriously engaged with the lore of Elden Ring, but this is even more obvious when you consider how these events map onto a spiral. The historical rupture point that gave rise to this spiral of violence was the initial agreement between Marika and the Hornsent. We don't know the specific terms of this covenant, but we do know what both sides wanted: power. In their mutual pursuit of power, both Marika and the Hornsent realized that, in order to achieve their goals, they needed to torture and dismember countless shamans to construct the Divine Gate. This was the first inflection point in the spiral, and an opportunity for both sides to reflect on the enormous cost associated with their pursuit of power. Apparently, this was an acceptable cost for both Marika and the Hornsent. Indeed, the shamans were ultimately abducted and tortured en masse, and their bodies were piled up, along with those of countless Hornsent, to form the Divine Gate. This was the second inflection point in the spiral. It wasn't too late. Marika's ascension was not inevitable. Marika and the Hornsent could have walked away. They should have realized that if something requires mountains of tortured bodies, that something should not be trifled with. And yet, trifle they did. The Hornsent of Enir-Ilim, in their utter desperation to affirm that they were, in fact, divine beings destined for greatness, granted Marika access to the Divine Gate, and supplied her with all the bodies she would need to summon the Elden Beast. And Marika, intent on sating her thirst for power, desecrated these bodies in order to allow herself to become a vessel for the Elden Beast, and, by extension, the Elden Ring. As it turned out, Marika's thirst for power could not be sated. Despite her ascension, Marika remained vulnerable, or at least she thought she was. And so, she committed genocide after genocide in an attempt to consolidate power, leading ultimately to, well, you know. What then do these spirals of violence tell us about ourselves as individuals, communities, and societies? They tell us something that I've been saying on this channel for more than 10 years now, that it matters how we engage with, and especially how we talk about, video games and their stories. These discourses aren't neutral, and they certainly aren't without material effects. Indeed, as we've seen, many in the Elden Ring community attempted not just to justify Marika's genocide of the Hornsent, but to justify this crime of crimes on the basis of the flimsiest of evidence. These discourses both reflect and reproduce those concerned with justifying Israel's genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. That so many people think genocide can be justified, and that the bar for such a justification is so very low. That tells us something deeply unsettling about the persistence of imperial logics in our collective imagination. What's more is that there's a tremendous irony in how some on the right react when confronted with an analysis of a video game that's informed by real-world political issues, because these people are clearly looking for content that seriously engages with a game they enjoy, but they react with a sort of righteous indignation when this engagement encroaches on their political beliefs. These are often the same people who would laugh derisively at the notion of a safe space, and yet they clearly feel like they're entitled to a safe space where they can let their genocidal, imperial imaginations run wild without fear of consequences. It's clear that the right has been emboldened not just by Israel's boastful acceleration of its genocide in Gaza, but also by Donald Trump's subsequent return to the White House, which is to say that their masks have slipped, and they're not currently all that concerned about putting them back on. For this reason, the parallels between gaming and real-world political discourses have never been more glaring than they are today. It would be a grievous error to ignore these parallels, as they represent an opportunity to achieve transformative societal change. So, if you see connections between video games, political realities, and the associated discourses, it's more important than ever to point them out, discuss them, raise the critical consciousness of those around you by identifying how these discourses generate material effects that are capable of either reinforcing or disrupting the status quo. And don't allow naysayers to dismiss your analysis by saying things like,
"It's just a game,"
and
"You shouldn't bring politics into games."
The discursive sleight of hand at play here is fairly obvious, but allow me to spell it out. These people don't actually have a problem discussing political issues in gaming contexts. It just has to be the right type of politics. What they're actually saying, in other words, is that they don't want to disrupt the status quo because it benefits them at the expense of others. Call them out for this, or simply ignore them. Their comfort should not be your concern. Similar discursive tricks are often used to dismiss pro-Palestine advocacy efforts in Western nations that have directly or indirectly facilitated Israel's genocide in Gaza. For example, in a thread posted to the Canada subreddit that was concerned with a pro-Palestinian rally in Montreal, this comment ended up with a net karma score of over 1,000.
Canadians are experts at protesting for foreign causes that don't affect the majority of Canadians. Can't be bothered to rally the troops for any domestic issues, though. We'll even protest Trump before protesting the lack of housing, healthcare, jobs, and mass immigration.
This distinction between domestic and foreign issues is little more than a distraction. The genocide in Gaza is inextricably linked to domestic issues like inadequate housing, healthcare, and employment, because they're all consequences of imperialism and capitalism. Capitalism necessarily involves accumulation by dispossession and artificial scarcity, which limits the availability of adequate housing, quality healthcare, and well-paying jobs for the average person. And it's the imperial mindset that allows us, as societies, to deprive others of these basic necessities. Capitalism and imperialism are also jointly responsible for facilitating Canada's approach to immigration, which is explicitly designed to exploit cheap foreign labor for the benefit of corporations. And so, when this user dismisses pro-Palestine advocacy efforts as being unrelated to these issues, they're reinforcing the discursive separation of issues that are actually closely related, even if they're not aware of it. These discursive tricks are not exclusive to Canada. During the recent US presidential election, for instance, many Democrats implored those concerned about the genocide in Gaza to pledge their support for a presidential candidate who, as vice president, actively supported Israel's genocide for years and gave absolutely no indication during her campaign that she intended to do anything different as president. Indeed, at the 2024 Democratic National Convention, Harris proudly proclaimed that she will always stand up for Israel's right to defend itself, and that she will always ensure Israel has the ability to defend itself. In other words, Harris pledged her unwavering support for Israel's military occupation, its apartheid state, and its genocide against Palestinians. It's not terribly surprising then that she used this same speech to perpetuate Israel's atrocity propaganda and to straight up lie by claiming that she had been working with Joe Biden around the clock to secure a ceasefire. In reality, the Biden administration never placed any kind of pressure on Israel. In fact, Israel is so hopelessly dependent on American diplomatic, economic, and military support that all Biden had to do was simply pick up the phone and tell him to stop. He never did. In spite of this, some Democrats had the audacity to blame pro-Palestinian activists for refusing to vote for Harris. In effect, these individuals are suggesting that in order to combat imperialism abroad, you have to support imperialism domestically. This is, of course, absurd. You don't fight imperialism with imperialism. You fight imperialism by refusing to support imperialist political candidates, full stop, even if those candidates are kinder or slightly less fascistic than those to their right, and by supporting alternative political candidates and parties who are firmly committed to anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist political philosophies. In the absence of such alternatives, the Earth is descending in spirals of violence. These spirals are animated by the persistence of the imperial imagination and the entrenchment of capitalism, which together promote and facilitate violence against the Earth and violence against its most vulnerable inhabitants. To escape the spiral, we need to decolonize our minds. That means divesting ourselves of any notion that one group of people ought to dominate or control another group of people. That means rejecting outright any and all attempts to justify the unjustifiable, including ethnic cleansing, apartheid, and genocide. That means addressing the root cause of the downward spiral, including rejecting half-hearted attempts at reconciliation that fail to reckon with the central role played by capitalism in subjugating indigenous peoples, dispossessing them of their lands, and erasing their cultures. That means refusing to support imperialist political candidates who are committed to maintaining the status quo. Otherwise, we are collectively doomed to spiral downwards and, well, you know. It won't be easy to dismantle capitalism, to defeat imperialism, to escape the spiral. But through transnational collective action, anything is possible. Palestinians are doing their part. It's time for the rest of us to do ours.